The year was 1839, and England was a land caught between progress and poverty. The Industrial Revolution had filled the air with the smoke of factories, but its wealth reached only the few. In rural villages and working-class towns, families struggled each day to survive. Wages were meager, bread was scarce, and winter's cold bit deeper than most could endure. It was in one such Yorkshire village, nestled among rolling hills and damp cobblestone lanes, that the story of Thomas Redford began. The village itself seemed ordinary at first glance. Children played barefoot in the fields during summer. Neighbors greeted one another at the market, and church bells rang faithfully every Sunday morning. Yet beneath this surface lay hardship. Families often sent their children to work long hours in textile mills or mines. Mothers rationed bread into thin slices, praying it would last through the week. Disease swept through homes with little warning, and few doctors could be afforded by the poor. Hope was fragile, and grief was all too common. Thomas Redford lived on the edge of this struggling community, in a modest stone cottage with a thatched roof that had seen better years. He was not wealthy, nor particularly remarkable in appearance. What made him different was his burden. He was a widower. His wife, Margaret, had died giving birth to their youngest child 2 winters before, leaving him with 3 little ones to raise alone. At first, Thomas tried to continue as best he could. He worked odd jobs in the fields, cut wood for neighbors, and stretched every coin he earned. But grief shadowed him. Without Margaret's warmth, the cottage felt hollow. At night, when the children had finally fallen asleep, Thomas often sat in silence by the fire, staring at the flames until they flickered out. He rarely spoke of his pain, for in those days, men were not encouraged to weep or seek comfort. Instead, he swallowed his sorrow, and it hardened inside him like stone. The children, innocent as they were, noticed the change in their father. His once gentle voice grew strained, his patience shorter, his laughter gone. The eldest, a boy of 9, tried to help by watching over his younger siblings. But even he could not replace the mother they all missed. Hunger gnawed at their small bodies, and illness was never far. The neighbors offered what help they could, a loaf of bread here, a blanket there. Yet pride and shame kept Thomas from asking for more. The village itself was not unkind. People whispered about the Redford family, but not with malice, rather with pity. They knew widowhood was a heavy cross, especially for a man raising children alone in such cruel times. Still, life left little room for compassion when most were fighting to survive themselves. In such an environment, loneliness often bred despair. Thomas began to withdraw further. He stopped attending church, where once he had gone every Sunday with Margaret by his side. He avoided the tavern and market, preferring to keep to himself. Nights grew longer, his mind restless, haunted by thoughts he dared not share. He wondered if his children would suffer endlessly as he had. He wondered if this life, filled with hunger, cold, and grief, was worth enduring. And in those dark musings a seed of delusion began to grow. Superstition still held a strong grip on many rural folk in 1839. Some believed curses could follow families, that tragedy was the will of God or punishment for hidden sins. Others believed in omens, black birds circling, a broken mirror, a sudden illness, as signs of more misfortune to come. Thomas, weakened by grief, found himself listening to these whispers. He began to believe his family was cursed, that suffering was inevitable, and that his children's lives would only be filled with the same pain that consumed him. One neighbor recalled later how Thomas once muttered, "Better they sleep in peace than wake to suffer." At the time, she dismissed it as the talk of a grieving man. But in hindsight, those words carried a chilling foreshadowing. The cottage grew darker in spirit as months passed. Where once the laughter of children echoed against stone walls, silence now lingered. Thomas became more distant, though he still provided food when he could. The children, sensing something they could not understand, clung to one another. They whispered their fears in the night, yet still trusted their father, for in their young hearts, he was the only protector they had left. The village, however, carried on as usual. The market bustled, mills churned, and carriages rattled across muddy roads. People were too consumed by their own struggles to notice how deep Thomas had sunk into despair. It was a world where suffering was common, and one man's grief could easily be lost in the crowd. But grief has a way of festering when left unseen. What began as silent mourning slowly twisted into something more dangerous. Thomas, isolated and broken, no longer saw clearly. His love for his children, once a guiding light, was clouded by fear and hopelessness. And though he believed he was protecting them, he was walking a path toward tragedy. The village in darkness was not only the setting of Thomas's life, but also the reflection of his heart. Poverty, loneliness, and superstition wove together, blinding him to the possibility of hope. And as the year wore on, the stage was set for a decision that would shock not only his neighbors, but all who would later hear his tale. The tragedy of Thomas Redford did not begin with shovels and graves. It began in silence, in the quiet, crushing weight of grief, in the isolation of a widower's heart, and in a village too burdened by its own suffering to see how close despair had drawn to their doorstep. The storm rolled across the Yorkshire countryside one night in late autumn of 1839. The wind howled against the stone cottages, rattling shutters and carrying with it a bitter chill. For most families, it was simply another difficult night in a year, already marked by hunger and hardship. But inside the Redford cottage, something far darker was taking place. Something that would scar the memory of the village forever. Thomas Redford had spent the evening in silence. His 3 children, weary from the day, had huddled together near the hearth where the last embers of the fire glowed faintly. The eldest, only 9 years old, tried to reassure the younger ones, whispering stories their late mother once told to soothe them. Thomas, however, sat apart, staring at the wooden floor with eyes that seemed to see nothing. His thoughts churned like the storm outside. For weeks, despair had been gnawing at him like a relentless parasite. The weight of raising children alone, the endless nights of hunger, the hollow echo of a home without his wife. It had all driven him to a place where reason no longer had strength. He convinced himself that his children's future would be nothing but suffering, a mirror of his own misery. In his fractured mind, he saw death not as cruelty, but as mercy. When the children finally fell asleep, wrapped in a single thin blanket, Thomas rose from his chair. He stepped outside into the storm, rain stinging his face, and began digging into the earth behind the cottage. His hands blistered as he drove the shovel into the wet ground. To anyone who might have seen him, it would have looked like the work of a desperate farmer. But in truth, he was preparing graves. Hours passed. The storm covered the sounds of his labor. By the time Thomas returned inside, the pits were readied. His heart pounded, his mind clouded by a mix of anguish and determination. He knelt beside his sleeping children, brushing the hair from the youngest's face. A tear rolled down his cheek, but it did not stop him. In his mind, he believed he was sparing them from a lifetime of hunger, cold, and despair. One by one, he carried the children outside into the night. The eldest stirred and cried out, realizing something was wrong, but Thomas hushed him. His trembling hands lowered them into the shallow graves he had dug. Their voices, muffled by fear and confusion, rose into the night, but the wind swallowed their cries. With every shovelful of earth he cast over them, Thomas's heart shattered further, yet he pressed on, blinded by the twisted belief that he was giving them peace. By dawn, the deed was done. The storm had passed, leaving the village washed in silence. Smoke rose from chimneys as neighbors began their daily routines. Unaware that only a few yards away, behind a modest stone cottage, 3 small lives had been extinguished under the soil. It was not until midday that the horror was discovered. A neighbor, Mrs. Whitaker, had grown concerned when she noticed Thomas had not appeared at the market to collect bread as he usually did. She approached the cottage, knocked on the door, and received no reply. Pushing the door open, she found Thomas slumped at the table, pale and motionless, as though all strength had left him. The children were nowhere to be seen. Fear crept into her heart as she searched the house. It was then, glancing through the window, that she saw the freshly disturbed earth in the garden. She rushed outside, calling for help, and within minutes villagers gathered. Shovels tore into the soil, revealing what Thomas had done. The sight froze them with horror. Men stepped back in disbelief, women wept openly, and even the strongest among them could not find words. When the constable arrived, Thomas did not resist. He was led away in chains, his face streaked with tears. To the cries of the villagers, accusations of monster and murderer, he responded only with broken whispers. I only wanted to save them. I didn't want them to suffer. The act spread through the village like wildfire. Neighbors who had once pitied Thomas now recoiled in fear and disgust. Parents held their children closer, unable to comprehend how a father could betray the very trust that defines parenthood. The church bells tolled mournfully that evening, not for a holiday or service, but for the souls of 3 innocent children whose lives had been stolen. Yet, beneath the outrage, there was also sorrow. Many villagers, though horrified, recognized the shadow that had led Thomas to this point. The crushing grief of losing his wife, the loneliness of widowhood, the poverty that haunted his days. While they condemned his crime, some also whispered that despair, left unchecked, could drive any soul into darkness. The graves were consecrated properly days later. The children were laid to rest together, this time with dignity, as the village gathered to mourn. The preacher, his voice trembling, told the crowd, "This is what despair can do when it is left alone. Let this tragedy be not only a memory of sorrow, but a warning. We must watch over one another, for grief unattended can destroy more than one life." And so the act that shook the village became more than just a crime. It became a lesson written in grief. For years afterward, parents reminded their children of the story, not to frighten them, but to remind them of the fragile line between despair and hope. Thomas Redford's act was condemned, but it also awakened the community to the importance of compassion, of speaking when silence feels easier, and of reaching for help when grief threatens to overwhelm. The storm of that night passed quickly, but the storm Thomas carried in his heart had lingered for years, until it consumed him and the lives he loved most. And though time would eventually heal the land and the people, the echo of that night remained a haunting reminder that even the smallest cottage can hide the deepest sorrow, and that despair, when hidden, can lead to unthinkable acts. The arrest of Thomas Redford cast a heavy shadow over the village. Within hours of his unthinkable act being discovered, the story spread far beyond Yorkshire. Newspapers carried lurid headlines about the father who buried his own. Carriages arrived from nearby towns carrying reporters, magistrates, and clergymen eager to witness the case firsthand. For weeks, the entire country seemed gripped by the mystery of why a father would commit such a macabre crime. The trial was scheduled in York at the assizes, where the most serious crimes were judged. When the day came, the courthouse was crowded beyond capacity. Farmers, merchants, and city folk alike gathered outside, pressing against the wooden barriers in hopes of catching a glimpse of the man who had horrified the nation. Inside the courtroom, Thomas appeared gaunt, with sunken eyes and unkempt hair. He was led in chains, his shoulders stooped, his expression neither defiant nor angry, but wary, as though life itself had already passed from him. To the crowd, he looked less like a monster and more like a broken man who had surrendered to despair. The judge, robed in crimson, read the charges in a solemn voice. "Thomas Redford, you stand accused of the willful murder of your 3 children by burying them alive on the night of October 21st in the year of our Lord 1839. How do you plead?" Thomas, his voice trembling, whispered, "Guilty, but not out of malice." His words sent a murmur through the courtroom. A guilty plea was unusual, but his addition, "not out of malice," stirred both confusion and unease. The prosecution painted Thomas as a murderer who had betrayed the sacred duty of a father. Witnesses described the children, their laughter, their innocence, their cries in the night that storm. Neighbors testified to seeing Thomas digging in the rain, though they assumed at the time it was for planting or repairs. Mrs. Whittaker, the neighbor who discovered the disturbed earth, told the jury in a trembling voice how she had pulled away the soil with her own hands, revealing the children's lifeless bodies. The courtroom wept at her words. Even the most hardened men lowered their heads in silence. The prosecutor seized the moment, declaring, "If we do not deliver justice for these innocents, then who will speak for them? This man must answer for the crime of extinguishing lives he was charged to protect." But the defense argued a different story. not of malice, but of madness born from grief. A physician was called to the stand, who testified that Thomas showed signs of melancholia, a term used then for what we would now call depression. The doctor explained how grief, left untreated, could twist the mind until reason was lost. He did not kill from hatred, the physician said. He killed from a distorted belief that he was sparing his children from further suffering. His act was wicked, yes, but his heart was broken, not cruel. Other witnesses supported this view. A local pastor recalled how Thomas had stopped attending services after his wife's death, retreating into isolation. A farmer testified that Thomas often spoke of fearing for his children's future, worrying they would starve as he had starved in his youth. One woman remembered him saying, "Better they sleep in peace than wake to pain." At the time, she thought it a sad musing. Now it seemed like a prophecy. Finally, Thomas himself was called to speak. The courtroom fell silent as he rose to the stand, his chains clinking softly. His voice was quiet, but every word carried weight. "I loved my children," he began, his eyes fixed on the floor, "more than my own life. When Margaret died, the light went out of our home. I tried to keep them fed, I tried to keep them warm, but every day I saw their eyes grow emptier. I feared they would suffer as I suffered. I thought, God forgive me, I thought I was saving them. I see now that I was blind." His confession was not one of denial or excuses. It was the raw voice of a man who had realized too late the horror of his actions. Many in the room wept openly, others shook their heads in disbelief. The judge himself paused, his stern mask cracking for a moment. After days of testimony, the jury was left with a difficult choice. The evidence of the crime was undeniable. 3 children buried alive. But the question was whether Thomas acted out of cold intent or a broken mind. In the end, the verdict was delivered guilty of murder, but with a recommendation for mercy due to his mental state. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment, declaring, "Justice demands you pay for the lives taken, yet we acknowledge that despair, more than cruelty, guided your hand." The trial did not end with the sentencing. Across England, debates flared in newspapers and homes. Some condemned the leniency, demanding death for a man who had taken innocent lives. Others saw in his story a painful truth that grief and despair, when left untended, could destroy not just one soul, but many. Clergymen used the case as a sermon against hopelessness. Writers called for greater compassion toward widows and the poor, and in quiet conversations, families reminded one another to watch for signs of despair in their neighbors. To speak, to comfort, to act before sorrow grew into madness. The truth that emerged from the trial was not only about Thomas Redford's guilt. It was about the human heart, and how fragile it can become under the weight of grief. His act was monstrous, but it revealed something society had long ignored, that despair is as dangerous as any weapon, and silence can be deadlier than cruelty. When Thomas was led away to begin his sentence, the villagers watched from the roadside. Some cursed him, others bowed their heads in pity. He shuffled past them, chains dragging, his face pale but tear-streaked. For the village, the trial closed the chapter on the crime, but it opened a new one on the meaning of despair. From then on, Thomas Redford's name was not spoken only with horror, but with warning. His story became a reminder that when grief goes unnoticed, it can end in tragedy too heavy for any community to bear. The Redford children were laid to rest in the small churchyard on the hill above the village. The graves were dug side by side, a row of 3, as though in death they would remain united, inseparable. The whole village gathered for the funeral, their faces marked not only by grief but by shame. Shame that they had not seen or had not acted before tragedy struck. The funeral was simple but heavy with sorrow. No mother stood at the graveside, only neighbors, elders, and children clutching their parents' hands tightly as if to anchor them. The preacher's voice wavered as he read from the book of Psalms. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted, and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Many wept, not only for the 3 small coffins lowered into the earth, but for the broken man sitting in a prison cell who had once called himself their father. When the final clods of earth fell upon the caskets, silence filled the churchyard. It was not the silence of completion, but the silence of reflection, the kind of silence that plants seeds of lessons too heavy to ignore. A week later, the villagers pooled their meager resources to erect a headstone. It was plain limestone, roughly cut, for none could afford marble or elaborate carving. Yet what mattered most were the words etched upon it. After much debate, the villagers agreed on a single line: "Let not despair blind the heart to love." These words were more than an epitaph. They were a warning, a lesson, and a plea to future generations. The children's graves were not to be remembered only as symbols of horror, but as reminders of what despair could do when left unchecked. In the months that followed, the graves became a place of pilgrimage. Villagers came not only to mourn but to think. Mothers brought their children and whispered to them, "See, little one, this is why we must never hide our sadness. Speak it, share it, let us carry it together." Fathers came and laid their rough hands upon the stone, vowing silently to guard their families not only from hunger and illness, but from despair. Even travelers from nearby towns came after hearing of the tragedy. Some left flowers, others knelt in prayer. For many, it was not curiosity but empathy that drew them. Everyone had known grief. Everyone feared what despair might do to a soul. Over time, the graves became less about the children themselves and more about the living who came to remember them. Each visit was a reminder that suffering cannot be borne alone. The stone's inscription urged people to notice the signs of hopelessness in others. The silence, the withdrawal, the heavy eyes. It taught them to ask questions, to offer bread, to listen without judgment. The Redford children, though gone, had become teachers in death. Their story echoed in the marketplace, in sermons, in homes by the fire. Whenever someone struggled under the weight of loss, neighbors would say, "Do not be like Thomas. Speak your sorrow, let us bear it with you." The tragedy sparked change in the village. Though they were poor, the people began to form what they called compassion circles. Families would meet weekly, not only to share food but to share burdens. Widows, once left to fend for themselves, now found hands reaching out to help. Orphans who might once have been overlooked found homes among neighbors. The pastor reminded his flock that charity was not just bread for the hungry, but companionship for the lonely. Slowly, the spirit of the village shifted. Out of grief grew solidarity. Out of sorrow grew compassion. The graves on the hill became a kind of silent preacher, reminding all who passed that despair must never be allowed to grow in silence again. As years turned into decades, the story of the Redford children was passed from parents to children, and from them to their own children. It was told not as a tale of horror, but as a moral lesson. Parents would say at bedtime, "There was once a father who forgot that love is stronger than despair. He lost his way, and in doing so, he lost what he held most dear. Learn from him, my child, and never let sorrow blind you." For the children of the village, the graves were a place both feared and respected. Some would run past quickly, whispering that the children's spirits lingered there. Others would stop and lay wildflowers, whispering prayers for strength. Regardless of the superstition, all agreed the graves carried meaning. News of the tragedy and of the inscription carved on the headstone reached beyond the village. Newspapers that had once printed lurid details of the crime now reported on the lessons the village had drawn from it. Clergymen across England used the story in sermons about despair, family, and the need for compassion. One London paper wrote, "Though the act was macabre, the villagers have turned tragedy into testimony. The graves of the Redford children remind us all despair, left alone, is a shadow that consumes not one, but many." Thus, the story became more than local lore. It became part of the cultural memory of grief and endurance in 19th century England. The stone itself, though weathered by rain and frost, stood for generations. Its words never faded from the hearts of those who read them. They were carved not only into limestone, but into the very consciousness of the people. The greatest lesson was clear: love must be stronger than despair. For while despair blinds, love restores sight. While despair isolates, love unites. And while despair destroys, love endures. The Redford children did not live to grow, but through their graves, they became silent voices for hope. Their tragedy taught countless others that pain should never be hidden, and that compassion is the shield against despair. By the time a new generation rose in the village, the story was told less with tears and more with resolve. It was no longer just about what was lost, but about what had been gained. A community awakened to the importance of kindness, vigilance, and shared burdens. The graves on the hill still looked out over the village, the stones still bearing its simple inscription. And every time a villager passed, they were reminded, despair can blind, but love, when chosen, can heal. The tragedy of Thomas Redford and his children cast a long shadow over the village, but from within that shadow, a faint light began to grow. What had once been a community content to keep to itself, wary of speaking too openly about grief, suffering, or personal struggles, slowly began to awaken to a new reality. Silence was dangerous and awareness was necessary. For generations, the English countryside had been built upon values of stoicism. Men worked their fields, women tended their homes, and few dared to reveal their deepest burdens. Hardship was expected, and sorrow was considered something to endure quietly rather than share. But the story of Thomas Redford forced people to confront the truth. When sorrow is buried instead of spoken, it can fester until it destroys everything in its path. At first, conversations were hesitant. People spoke of the tragedy in hushed tones, as though speaking too loudly might awaken the horror again. But over time, those whispers grew bolder. Villagers began asking one another questions they had never dared before. How are you coping? Do you have enough to eat? Do you sleep well at night? These simple questions carried a weight they had never held before. For the first time, people began to look beyond the surface of their neighbors' lives. Awareness was growing, rooted in the painful lesson that Thomas's suffering had gone unnoticed until it was too late. The church became a central place in this transformation. The pastor, who had once limited his sermons to scripture and tradition, began weaving Thomas's story into his messages. Week after week, he reminded his congregation that faith was not only about prayer, but also about action. He would say, "What good is our prayer if we do not extend a hand? What good is our faith if we do not open our ears to the cries of the sorrowful?" These words stirred hearts. Congregants who had once nodded silently during service now left with a renewed sense of duty, not only to God but to each other. It was in these pews that the first seeds of true awareness were planted. The tragedy had shown them that salvation did not come only through ritual, but through compassion, vigilance, and shared humanity. Interestingly, it was the children of the village who carried the lessons most visibly. Parents, determined never to let the story repeat itself, taught their sons and daughters about the dangers of despair. They spoke openly about emotions in a way that older generations never had. Schoolteachers noticed the difference too. Children began looking out for one another. If one child came to school hungry or looked sad, others would speak up. Compassion was no longer seen as weakness, but as strength. The innocence of the young transformed the tragedy into a generational shift. The graves on the hill, once symbols of darkness, became markers of awareness for these children. Whenever they passed by, they were reminded suffering must never remain hidden. The story of Thomas Redford spread far beyond the small Yorkshire community. Newspapers, preachers, and even traveling storytellers carried it into cities and towns across England. Some told it as a cautionary tale of madness, but others focused on the deeper moral, the need to watch over one another, to notice despair before it consumed lives. In some towns, charitable societies were formed in the wake of hearing the tale. People began to speak more openly about melancholia, once treated only as personal weakness. While medical understanding was still limited, social understanding grew. And that awareness, though imperfect, saved lives in ways statistics could never measure. In the homes of the village, awareness took shape in simple but profound practices. Families began sharing more meals together, no longer treating silence as a shield. Fathers spoke to their sons not only about work and duty, but about fear and sadness. Mothers reminded their daughters that tears were not a mark of weakness, but of humanity. The change was subtle but powerful. No longer did the hearthside carry only the crackle of fire and the clink of spoons. It carried words, honest words, raw words, that bound families closer. What Thomas had lacked in his darkest hour, others began to give freely to one another, listening ears and open hearts. Still, the villagers knew that awareness could fade if neglected. Memory has a way of softening, of turning tragedies into distant legends rather than urgent warnings. And so, every year, the pastor led a short procession to the children's graves on the anniversary of their deaths. Prayers were spoken, not just for the lost children, but for all who carried unseen burdens. It became a ritual of remembrance and vigilance, a way to keep awareness alive. Let not despair blind the heart to love, the stone reed, and each year those words echoed fresh in the minds of all who gathered. For many, awareness became a kind of inheritance. Families who once might have passed down only land, tools, or heirlooms now passed down the story of Thomas Redford. Parents reminded their children that tragedy could strike not only from illness or war, but from within the human heart. Thus, awareness became more than a lesson. It became a shield. The darkness that had once swallowed one family was now a guiding light for many others. From darkness, awareness was born, an awareness that suffering must never be ignored, that despair must never be left to grow in silence. The village, once ordinary, became extraordinary not because of its tragedy, but because of how it responded. They could not undo the past. They could not bring back the Redford children or erase Thomas's despair, but they could, and did, ensure that no family would ever again suffer in silence within their walls. And so, awareness spread not like wildfire, sudden and destructive, but like dawn light creeping over the horizon, steady, persistent, illuminating. The tragedy of 1839 remained carved into the memory of the people, but where there had once been only darkness, there was now vigilance, compassion, and awareness. The Redford children became more than victims. They became silent guardians of the community's conscience, and Thomas Redford, though condemned, became the reminder of what can happen when despair is unseen. In the end, the village learned that awareness is not merely knowing, it is noticing, acting, and carrying each other's burdens before sorrow becomes unbearable. That awareness, born from darkness, would shine for generations to come. The story of Thomas Redford and his children did not fade when the soil hardened over the 3 small graves. Instead, it became an enduring echo, whispered in church pews, retold by hearth fires, and passed through generations like a shadow that refused to vanish. For the villagers, and later for many beyond their borders, it was not just a tale of horror, but an eternal warning, a reminder of what happens when despair goes unseen and love is smothered by silence. Most tragedies lose their sharpness with time. A year passes, then 10, and the pain dulls, but not this one. The Redford children, buried too soon, seemed to haunt the collective memory of the people. The graves, etched with the words, "Let not despair blind the heart to love," stood like a sentinel on the hill, keeping watch not only over the village but over their conscience. Parents would point to the headstone when walking with their children and say, "This is what happens when sorrow is hidden. Remember, my child, never carry your burdens alone." In this way, the children's deaths became part of the moral fabric of the community, a story stitched so tightly into its identity that it could never unravel. Over time, the warning reached far beyond the village. It traveled with merchants who repeated the tale in taverns, with clergymen who used it in sermons, and with writers who found in it a parable of human weakness and strength. In towns and cities where poverty and grief also ran deep, the story struck a nerve. Some dismissed it as an exaggerated folktale, too grotesque to be true. But for many, it rang with a chilling plausibility. They knew despair themselves. They had seen what it could do to men and women left without comfort. For them, the Redford tragedy was less a tale of horror and more a mirror reflecting their own vulnerabilities. The eternal warning was not carved only in stone. It was carved into hearts. The people learned that despair was not a private matter, but a shared responsibility. When someone withdrew into silence, neighbors knocked at their door. When a widow lost her husband, the community did not wait until she faltered. They carried food, warmth, and words of comfort before the shadows grew too deep. This cultural shift was perhaps the greatest legacy of the tragedy. It taught that awareness was not enough on its own. It had to be followed by action. Compassion had to be lived, not merely preached. As generations passed, the warning transformed into ritual. On the anniversary of the children's burial, the villagers walked to the churchyard carrying lanterns. They placed them on the graves so that the hill glowed with soft light in the darkness. It was both a vigil and a vow never again would despair go unanswered. Children grew up with these vigils as part of their memory. They learned the names of the Redford children as though they were family, and though the details of the trial blurred over time, the warning remained sharp: love must rise louder than despair. What gave the story its endurance was not its gruesomeness, but its universality. Grief is not confined to one century or one village. Every family, at some point, faces loss, hardship, or hopelessness. The warning of Thomas Redford was therefore timeless when left unchecked. Despair can twist even love into destruction. It was a lesson that resonated in times of war, famine, and poverty. Whenever despair loomed, people recalled the Redfords and whispered, "We must not let darkness take another soul." Even in prison, Thomas Redford remained part of the warning. Reports of his life behind bars told of a man who rarely spoke, who carried himself as if crushed beneath the weight of what he had done. Some said he prayed constantly, asking forgiveness. Others said he simply stared at the walls, as though watching the memory of his children play across the stone. Whether he was seen as a monster or a broken man, his story became inseparable from the warning. He was proof that despair, left untended, could consume even a father's love. He was both the villain and the cautionary figure in the tale, reminding all who heard it that tragedy does not always come from malice. Sometimes it comes from unchecked sorrow. Years later, as the Industrial Revolution reshaped England, the Redford story still circulated. Factory workers, facing long hours and harsh conditions, repeated it to remind themselves of the importance of solidarity. Clergymen in the growing cities used it to preach against isolation, urging parishioners to look after one another. Even reformers, campaigning for better treatment of the poor, invoked the Redfords as an example of what neglect could cause. The story had grown far larger than its original village. It had become a symbol of humanity's constant battle with despair. What makes the story of Thomas Redford so enduring is that its lesson never loses relevance. In every age, there are those who carry unbearable burdens in silence. In every society, there are people who slip into despair unnoticed until it is too late. The eternal warning remains: silence is dangerous and compassion is necessary. It tells us to ask questions, to listen deeply, to act kindly. It tells us that despair does not need judgment, it needs understanding. Above all, it tells us that love, when expressed, can interrupt tragedy before it begins. The graves of the Redford children still stand on that hill, weathered by time but firm in their testimony. The stone's inscription may grow faint, but the warning it carries will never fade. Let not despair blind the heart to love. Those words are more than an epitaph. They are an eternal call, a voice that reaches beyond 1839, beyond one village, beyond one father's sorrow. They remind us that despair is a shadow that touches us all, but love, when chosen, is the light that endures.